January 1942. Morning light falls across a neighborhood street in Tokyo. Newspapers hang from wooden racks. Radios hum behind sliding doors. School children walk in lines, their voices steady, their steps light. Headlines speak of victories far from home, names of islands most readers have never seen. Printed in bold ink, the words promise momentum. They promise inevitability. In cafes and tramcars, conversations carry the same quiet confidence. America is distant, vast, perhaps, but soft. A nation of factories without spirit, of people untested by sacrifice. That belief has been repeated often enough to feel like fact. It lives in classrooms, editorials, and evening broadcasts. It requires no argument anymore. The war, for now, feels abstract. No smoke rises here. No sirens cut the air. The city moves as it always has. Shops open, trains run on time. Life continues under the assumption that it will remain untouched. But war has a way of collapsing distance. And beyond the horizon far, beyond the reach of today's headlines, forces are already moving that will carry the conflict from rumor to reality, and from belief to reckoning. By the early 1930s, Japan had already chosen its path. Economic pressure, resource scarcity, and a growing belief in national destiny pushed the country toward expansion. The trauma of the Great Depression hardened political attitudes. While military leaders gained increasing influence over civilian institutions, Parliament still existed. Newspapers still printed, but the boundaries of acceptable thought narrowed year by year. Education became one of the most powerful tools in shaping public belief. From primary school onward, children were taught a version of history centered on continuity, obedience, and sacrifice. The state was not merely a government. It was an extension of something older and sacred. Loyalty was framed not as political choice, but as moral duty. At the center of this worldview stood Emperor Hirohito, presented to civilians less as a decision-maker than as a symbol of national unity and historical inevitability. Newspapers and radio reinforced the message daily. Reports emphasized discipline, spirit, and righteousness. Foreign powers were described in simplified terms. The United States, in particular, was portrayed as wealthy but shallow, strong in machines, yet weak in will. These narratives were not always shouted. More often, they were calmly repeated until they felt self. This confidence did not emerge in isolation. Japan's victories in Asia before 1941 played a decisive role. The rapid occupation of Manchuria in 1931, followed by years of hard fighting in China after 1937, created a sense that momentum favored Japan. Even when battles were costly, official messaging focused on endurance and inevitability rather than loss. Civilian understanding of the war was shaped less by casualty figures and more by the assurance that sacrifice served a higher purpose. Censorship ensured that alternative perspectives rarely reached the public. Editors knew which stories could be printed and which could not. Photographs of suffering were limited. Reports of stalemate were softened. Defeat was rarely named directly. The result was not constant hysteria, but something quieter and more powerful. Normality built on selective truth. By the late 1930s, many Japanese civilians viewed war not as chaos, but as a test of character, one they believed their society was uniquely prepared to pass. Industrial limitations were acknowledged, but spiritual strength was assumed to compensate. This belief was reinforced by comparisons carefully chosen by the state. American society was described as individualistic and indulgent, while Japan was presented as unified and disciplined. The contrast was meant to feel decisive. Importantly, this mindset did not require hatred. For many civilians, America was not an immediate enemy, but a distant abstraction. The Pacific Ocean still separated everyday life in Japan from any direct confrontation. Few civilians had seen Americans. Fewer still had experienced American industry or military power firsthand. What they knew came filtered through commentary and repetition. By 1941, this worldview had settled into place. War, when it came, was expected to be brief and clarifying. The belief was not that Japan would avoid hardship, but that hardship would be endured, and that endurance itself would determine victory. Confidence rested not on detailed knowledge of American capacity, but on faith in Japan's own cohesion. That faith would soon be tested, because when the war expanded beyond Asia and collided directly with the United States, the assumptions carried by civilians at home would meet a conflict shaped not only by spirit, but by scale industrial, geographic, and human. When war with the United States finally arrived, it did so with speed and shock, but from the perspective of Japanese civilians. The opening months seemed to confirm everything they had been taught. On December 8, 1941, Japanese newspapers announced the attack on Pearl Harbor. The reports were triumphant yet restrained, emphasizing surprise and precision rather than destruction. For civilians reading the morning editions, the message was clear. Japan had struck first, struck decisively, and seized the initiative. The Pacific suddenly felt smaller, but the danger still felt distant. What followed in the months after only reinforced this sense of confidence. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 carried enormous symbolic weight, long described by Britain as an impregnable stronghold. It collapsed in just over a week. Newspapers framed the victory as proof that Western power was hollow beneath its reputation. For civilians at home, it was difficult not to believe the narrative. The campaigns in the Philippines followed a similar pattern. Reports highlighted the surrender of Allied forces and the capture of strategic territory. Names like Bataan and Corregidor entered public awareness stripped of their complexity, reduced to markers of progress on a steadily expanding map. Losses were rarely detailed. Hardship, when mentioned, was framed as honorable and necessary. At home, daily life remained largely unchanged. Rationing existed, but it was manageable. Air raid drills were conducted, but more as precaution than preparation. The war still lived mostly in print and on the radio. Factories increased output, but cities were not yet under threat. For many civilians, the conflict felt organized, controlled, almost distant. This distance mattered. It allowed early victories to shape perception without contradiction. The idea that America would struggle to sustain a long war felt plausible when measured against these rapid successes. Japanese propaganda emphasized that the enemy relied on mass production and morale, both of which were portrayed as fragile. The belief took hold that, once shocked and bloodied, American society would lose the will to continue. Crucially, the scale of American industry was still poorly understood by the public. Shipyards, aircraft, plants, and logistical systems operating far beyond the Pacific were invisible to Japanese civilians. What could not be seen was easier to dismiss. The war was judged by immediate results, not by long-term capacity. By mid-1942, the tone of reporting remained confident. Victories were celebrated. Setbacks were minimized or explained away. The message was consistent. Japan was winning because it deserved to win, because it was unified, disciplined, and spiritually prepared. Civilian morale rested on this continuity. There was little space for doubt and little reason, yet, to question the assumptions formed over the previous decade. But beneath the surface, the character of the war was already beginning to change. The distances involved, the demands of supply, and the scale of industrial replacement were quietly reshaping the conflict. Battles that did not fit the narrative were discussed less clearly, or not at all. The war was no longer abstract, yet for most civilians, its true weight had still not arrived only the belief that it would remain manageable, and that confidence itself would carry them forward. For Japanese civilians in 1942, belief was not loud, it was settled. Confidence did not come from daily excitement or constant celebration, but from repetition and routine. Newspapers arrived each morning. Radios spoke each evening. The tone rarely shifted. Victory was presented as normal, expected, almost administrative. This consistency mattered. It allowed civilians to place the war mentally at arm's length, something unfolding elsewhere, managed by capable hands. Psychologically, this created a form of insulation. The war existed, but it did not yet intrude. When danger is distant, the mind fills the gap with assumptions. Many civilians believed hardship would come, but not chaos. Loss, but not collapse. They expected endurance to be tested, not reality itself. This expectation shaped how information was received. Reports of success felt natural. Reports of difficulty felt temporary. Japanese society in the early 1940s placed enormous value on endurance. Patience, discipline, and self-sacrifice were not emergency virtues. They were everyday expectations. Civilians were accustomed to restraint. Long hours, limited comforts, and obedience to authority were normalized well before the war. When conflict expanded, it was framed as an extension of these values rather than a rupture from them. This cultural framework made early wartime confidence feel justified. Hardship did not signal weakness, it confirmed strength. The idea that victory might depend on comfort or abundance felt foreign. Instead, endurance itself was understood as a strategic asset. Compared to portrayals of American life as indulgent and divided, Japanese civilians were encouraged to see their own restraint as proof of superiority. Propaganda during this phase was rarely hysterical. It did not rely solely on slogans or caricature. Instead, it worked through omission and tone. Reports emphasized resolve and continuity. Losses were acknowledged selectively and framed as meaningful sacrifice. The absence of graphic detail was itself a message. There was nothing to fear, nothing to question. By controlling what was shown and what was not, information shaped belief without confrontation. Civilians were not asked to ignore reality. They were presented with a carefully edited version of it. Over time, this created confidence that felt earned rather than imposed. When doubt is never openly introduced, certainty becomes the default. Perhaps the most consequential angle was how the enemy was imagined. America, for most Japanese civilians, remained an abstraction. Few had direct experience with American society, industry, or military organization. What they knew came filtered through description and contrast. America was portrayed as large but disorganized, wealthy but soft, technologically capable yet lacking unity. This perception made early victories appear decisive rather than preliminary. If the enemy lacked resolve, then momentum alone might be enough. The vastness of American capacity, its ability to absorb losses and replace them at scale, was not part of civilian understanding. It existed beyond visibility, beyond daily experience. As long as America remained distant and symbolic, belief held. But wars are not decided by symbols alone. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the conflict began to generate facts that could not be edited as these new weapons appeared in reports. New battles resisted simplification. Casualties increased without corresponding triumphs. The angles that once reinforced confidence now began to strain under pressure. And with that strain came the first cracks, not yet visible on the surface, but forming beneath the certainty that had carried civilians through the war's opening year. By late 1942 and into 1943, fragments of a different reality began to surface. They did not arrive as dramatic revelations, but as inconsistencies. Reports mentioned American ships that seemed to reappear after being declared sunk. Aircraft losses on the Allied side no longer translated into reduced pressure. Battles stretched longer than expected. For civilians accustomed to linear progress, these details were difficult to reconcile. What remained largely invisible was the engine behind it all. American industrial scale shipyards along both coasts of the United States were launching vessels at a pace without historical precedent. Aircraft factories produced bombers and fighters in numbers that made individual losses irrelevant. For Japanese civilians, these figures were rarely presented in full. When mentioned, they were abstract numbers without physical presence. Belief had been shaped around endurance and morale. Industry, when discussed, was treated as secondary. But war was becoming a contest of replacement and reach. Each ship lost by Japan mattered deeply. Each aircraft lost carried trained crews that could not be easily replaced. Civilians did not see this balance directly, but its consequences began to emerge in subtle ways: longer service for older ships, fewer public celebrations, and a growing emphasis on sacrifice rather than success. Technology also altered the war in ways civilians struggled to perceive. Radar, improved communications, and coordinated air-sea operations changed how battles unfolded. These were not dramatic weapons, easily captured in photographs. They were systems quiet, technical, decisive. The enemy was no longer just visible fleets or distant aircraft. It was an integrated network extending across oceans. For civilians raised on stories of individual valor and spirit, this shift was difficult to grasp. Victory no longer hinged solely on courage at the point of contact. It depended on detection, coordination, and supply. These factors did not lend themselves to simple explanation or heroic imagery. As a result, they were often underemphasized in public discussion, leaving civilians with outdated mental models of how the war was being fought. Even as the industrial and technological balance shifted, most Japanese cities remained physically untouched. This gap between frontline reality and home-front experience delayed recognition. Air raid drills continued. Blackouts became more frequent, but for many civilians, these were still precautions, not responses to lived catastrophe. The distance allowed belief to persist longer than it otherwise might have. Confidence does not collapse easily when daily life continues. Shops still opened. Trains still ran. The absence of direct destruction sustained the idea that hardship remained manageable, that the core assumptions of the war were still intact. Doubt, when it came, arrived quietly. It appeared in the questions not asked aloud, in the tightening of language, in the increasing emphasis on endurance, without explanation. Official messaging shifted tone from confidence to obligation. Civilians were told not why victory was certain, but why sacrifice was necessary. This moral transition mattered. It marked the point where belief began to rely less on evidence and more on duty. When explanations narrow, endurance replaces understanding. Civilians adapted, as they always had, but adaptation is not the same as conviction. The war was no longer distant. Its shape was changing, and the assumptions that once framed it were becoming harder to maintain. Soon, the conflict would cross a threshold from something discussed to something endured. Belief would give way to experience. By 1943, the war had entered a phase that no amount of framing could fully contain. The language used in newspapers became more careful. Victories were described without losses were acknowledged without scale. For civilians reading between the lines, something fundamental was changing even if it was not yet spoken plainly. The first sign was duration. Battles no longer ended quickly. Campaigns extended across months, then years. Names of distant islands appeared repeatedly, no longer advancing steadily across maps, but circling the same places again and again. This repetition hinted at resistance, organized, persistent, and growing stronger rather than weaker. At sea, the imbalance became harder to disguise. Japanese civilians were accustomed to hearing of decisive engagements, clean outcomes with clear meaning. Now reports spoke of engagements without conclusion. Fleets withdrew. Aircraft failed to return. The war crossed the final boundary in 1944. What had once existed as reports and preparations became lived experience. The skyline assumed to be secure turned into a route of approach. Sirens replaced speculation. Sleep was interrupted not by rumor, but by sound. The first large-scale air raids on the Japanese home islands were framed as limited. Official language emphasized control, interception, resilience. But civilians did not need language to interpret what they were seeing. Aircraft engines overhead were unmistakable. Explosions did not require explanation. The war had arrived without ceremony. Cities built of wood and paper proved vulnerable in ways few had fully imagined. Fire spread faster than organization. Neighborhoods vanished within hours. For civilians, the scale of destruction was disorienting, not only because of its physical impact, but because it contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. The idea that endurance alone could protect them dissolved in the heat. Shelters filled with families clutching what they could carry. Streets that once marked routine now served as escape routes. Order gave way to urgency. The calm confidence of earlier years found no place here. Survival demanded immediate, individual decisions. Information during this phase became fragmented. Radios fell silent during raids. Newspapers reported damage after the fact, often without images. Civilians understood more from absence than from words. When entire districts disappeared from daily mention, their fate was already known. As raids intensified, shortages deepened. Food became scarce, infrastructure strained. Civilians spent more time navigating loss than interpreting strategy. The war was no longer something to be understood, was something to endure, moment by moment. Psychologically, this period marked the collapse of abstraction. America was no longer distant, no longer theoretical. It existed overhead, mechanical and relentless. The belief that the enemy lacked resolve no longer held meaning when raids continued night after night. Regardless of loss or distance, persistence itself became proof. For many civilians, the most painful realization was not defeat, but the assumptions formed over years did not simply fail. The qualities once dismissed as weakness, organization, scale revealed themselves as decisive. The qualities once celebrated as sufficient spirit and endurance proved inadequate alone. Yet, even a surrender of belief did not come easily. Civilians adapted because adaptation was all that remained. They rebuilt when possible. They evacuated when ordered. They learned to measure time by alarms and silences rather than by headlines. By early 1945, entire cities bore the marks of this transformation. What had begun as confidence ended as exhaustion, not the exhaustion of defeat alone, but of prolonged contradiction between what had been believed and what had been lived. The war had stripped away certainty. What remained was survival, memory, and the quiet understanding that reality had asserted itself without regard for expectation. When the fighting finally slowed, the landscape it left behind was difficult to comprehend. Entire districts had vanished. Streets no longer connected familiar places. Landmarks that once anchored memory were reduced to outlines, then to absence. For civilians emerging from shelters and evacuation centers, the first challenge was orientation, not just to place, but to meaning. Numbers circulated quietly at first. Casualties were counted in estimates rather than totals. Displacement became a shared condition rather than an exception. Families searched for relatives without knowing where to begin. Survival had been individual. Its consequences were collective. The war had not ended. Cleanliet had receded, leaving confusion in its wake. Food shortages persisted. Infrastructure damage complicated recovery. Civilians adapted again. But this adaptation felt different. It was no longer framed as sacrifice toward victory, but as necessity after loss. The language that once elevated endurance now struggled to explain outcome. Confidence, once so carefully maintained, had nowhere to settle. Psychologically, many civilians experienced a quiet shock rather than open despair. The collapse of belief was not explosive. It was gradual, unfolding as people compared memory with evidence. The cities around them did not match the future they had been promised. The assumptions that had shaped their understanding of the war no longer aligned with what they could see. Importantly, this reckoning did not arrive as sudden clarity. There was no single moment of realization. Instead, understanding accumulated through daily encounters with ruins, shortages, and silence. The absence of reassuring narratives forced civilians to confront the gap between expectation and reality on their own terms. The war's end also revealed how little civilians had been allowed to know. As restrictions loosened, fragments of information surfaced that had previously been inaccessible. The scale of Allied production, the attrition Japan had suffered, and the imbalance that had grown over years became harder to deny. These facts did not erase suffering, but they reframed it. For many, the most difficult adjustment was internal. Belief had once provided coherence. It explained sacrifice. It justified endurance. Without it, experiences that had been tolerable as contributions to victory became losses without compensation. This shift did not provoke anger as much as disorientation. Yet amid this resilience remained. Civilians cleared debris. They improvised. They shared what little they had. Survival instincts persisted even as certainty collapsed. What changed was the meaning attached to endurance. It was no longer proof of superiority, it was simply survival. The war had taken more than lives and cities. It had dismantled a worldview that had felt immovable, leaving civilians to reconstruct understanding from fragments rather than promises. With the formal end of the war, Japanese civilians entered a period defined less by recovery than by adjustment. Occupation brought new structures, new rules, and new voices into daily life. The presence of foreign authority transformed streets that had already been reshaped by destruction. For civilians, this shift was as psychological as it was physical. Information began to flow differently. Newspapers printed material that would once have been unthinkable. Radios carried unfamiliar perspectives. Civilians encountered explanations that contrasted sharply with what they had long accepted. The war, now discussed openly, appeared not as a sequence of inevitable victories and honorable sacrifices, but as a prolonged imbalance shaped by resources, strategy, and scale. This reframing did not arrive comfortably. For many, it carried a sense of quiet embarrassment rather than outrage. The mocking confidence implied in earlier beliefs was replaced by restraint. People spoke less about what they had assumed and more about what they had endured. Memory softened certainty. Daily life remained difficult. Housing shortages persisted. Food scarcity continued. Yet the urgency felt different. Survival was no longer bound to ideology. It was practical, immediate, and stripped of symbolism. Civilians learned to rebuild without grand narratives, focusing instead on stability. Over time, reflection replaced shock. People revisited the assumptions that had shaped their understanding of the war. The idea that spirit alone could offset industrial disadvantage lost its authority. The belief that distance ensured safety no longer held. The enemy, once dismissed as lacking resolve, was now recognized as possessing persistence of a different kind: mechanical, organizational, relentless. This recognition did not erase suffering or justify destruction. It clarified it. Civilians began to understand that the war had been decided long before it reached their streets, not by courage alone, but by capacity. The realization was sobering precisely because it had been invisible for so long. Importantly, this period did not produce a single collective conclusion. Responses varied. Some clung to fragments of the old worldview. Others rejected it entirely. Most lived somewhere in between, carrying memory without certainty. What united them was the absence of illusion. The war had ended, but its psychological aftermath continued. Beliefs do not disappear when contradicted. They fade through experience. For Japanese civilians,